It sounds impossible. 27,000 men, facing an army of 305,000, part of a larger invasion that would eventually total over 1 million soldiers. On paper, the numbers don't add up. Every instinct screams the smaller army should be crushed. Yet in 612 AD, at the Battle of Salsu, this tiny force did the unthinkable. They didn't just fight. They destroyed the invading army and turned what should have been a smooth conquest into a catastrophic disaster for the attackers. The invaders were the Sui Dynasty, marching into the Korean peninsula with ambition and confidence. Their army was vast, well-equipped, and seemingly unstoppable. But they were about to meet a force that knew terrain, timing, and psychological warfare in ways the Sui never imagined. Welcome to Great History, where we dive deep into the battles that shaped the world. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of history lovers. So how did a fraction of an army rout a massive force and turn a 1,000,000-man invasion into a disaster? What tricks and terrain did the defenders use to pull off the impossible? Let's find out. The Second Goguryeo-Sui War in 612 AD was the explosive endpoint of a geopolitical struggle that had been simmering since the moment China was reunified. When the Sui Dynasty finally brought an end to nearly 3 centuries of fragmentation in 589 AD, Emperor Yang didn't just inherit a united empire, he inherited a mission. In the ideology of the time, the newly restored Chinese state wasn't simply a regional power. It was supposed to be the center of the world, Tiania, the all-under-heaven order. And in that world view, any independent neighbor acting like an equal, especially a strong, confident, and well-fortified kingdom like Goguryeo, was more than a nuisance. It was a direct challenge to China's political legitimacy. Goguryeo, for its part, had no intention of bowing to anyone. Controlling huge portions of northern Korea and Manchuria, it held territory that was strategically invaluable. Its kings, including Yongyang, made it clear they would deal with the Sui emperor as equals, not as vassals. And they didn't just say this, they acted on it. Goguryeo launched small border raids to test Sui defenses, maneuvered diplomatically to complicate Sui ambitions, and even cultivated ties with powerful neighbors like the Eastern Turkic Khaganate. Goguryeo's army was built for asymmetric warfare, small unit mobility, hit-and-run engagements, terrain exploitation, and psychological manipulation. Their defensive network of mountain fortresses was designed not to win quick battles, but to drain time, supplies, and morale from any invading army. And their offensive punch? That came from the Gayamamusa. These elite heavy cavalry units were essentially the tanks of the 7th century. Both rider and horse were armored in heavy iron, and they fought primarily with long lances meant to punch straight through enemy lines. Against a retreating, weakened enemy, they were devastating. Exactly the kind of force you'd unleash on a starving column trying to cross a river. Plus, Goguryeo wasn't just a military machine. Its capital at Pyongyang was a thriving trade center and a heavily fortified command hub. A capital city shielded by layers of mountain fortresses, defensive lines, and hundreds of kilometers of rugged terrain. Anyone invading that space wasn't just fighting an army. They were fighting geography too. And that's a lesson Emperor Wen learned the hard way back in 598 AD. Emperor Wen's first campaign threw around 300,000 soldiers at Goguryeo, but the invasion quickly fell apart. Not because the Sui lacked manpower, but because the conditions on the ground were brutal. Torrential rains turned the roads into mud pits, destroyed supply movement, and immobilized troops. Disease spread. Goguryeo's mountain forts held strong. The Sui army trudged home exhausted and humiliated. That failure was a major turning point. It proved that Goguryeo was one of the hardest possible targets an ancient empire could face. Any future invasion would need a massive increase in scale, preparation, and logistical power. And Emperor Yang, ambitious, proud, and eager to prove himself, took that lesson personally. To fix the failures of 598, he decided not to make a bigger army. He decided to make the biggest army anyone had ever seen. Emperor Yang launched a preparation plan so vast that even historians today struggle to wrap their heads around it. At the heart of that overhaul was the construction of the Grand Canal, a truly colossal project linking northern and southern China by water. The canal was the artery through which grain, weapons, workers, and soldiers could flow at unprecedented speed. With the canal completed, the emperor green-lit one of the largest mobilizations in recorded ancient history. According to the Book of Sui, the empire called up 1,133,800 combat troops, that's the official number, and an estimated 2 million additional support personnel. Porters, engineers, cooks, clerks, boatmen, and laborers. Imagine the physical size of that. Some historians point out that these numbers might be inflated by Tang-era writers who wanted to dramatize Sui's collapse, but even with exaggeration, we're still looking at the single largest pre-gunpowder mobilization ever attempted. And there's a detail that really helps put it into perspective. It took 40 days for the entire army column to finish departing. 40 days, just to get everyone moving. The marching column stretched out for roughly 300 kilometers. That's like a line of soldiers stretching from New York City all the way to Baltimore. If you were standing on a hill and watching the army march past, you could stand there from sunrise to sunset and still see troops on the road. It was the kind of thing that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying at the same time. This wasn't just about winning a war. It was about proving something, both to the emperor's own people and to every neighboring power watching from the sidelines. The Sui regime wanted the world to see that this newly reunified, newly confident empire could project absolute, overwhelming force beyond its borders. A normal-sized army wouldn't send that message. A continent-wide avalanche of manpower would. To avoid repeating the direct frontal assault that had failed in 598, the Sui changed their approach. In theory, the strategy wasn't bad. The main Sui army would pin down Goguryeu's heavily fortified frontier line. Places like Yodong Fortress, which had a reputation for being almost impossible to take quickly. Meanwhile, a specially selected vanguard of 305,000 troops, led by trusted commanders like Yuan Shu and Yu Zhongwen, would slip around those defenses and march straight toward Pyongyang. If everything went right, Goguryeu's border troops would be stuck defending their fortresses while a massive spearhead stabbed directly at the capital. But that's the key phrase: if everything went right. From the start, the entire plan collided with a huge structural flaw at the heart of the Sui military machine: Emperor Yang's extreme centralization of authority. Yang didn't trust his generals. More importantly, he didn't want any major victory to occur without him personally approving it. So he issued secret mandates that any significant maneuver, or, as he reportedly phrased it, any really exciting event, had to wait for his direct permission. You can already guess how this played out on the front lines. There's a famous moment that shows how ridiculous this became. When the defenders of Yodong seemed ready to surrender, an enormous breakthrough, the Sui general in command had to stop everything and send a messenger all the way back to Chang'an for imperial approval. Weeks were lost. And in those quiet, bureaucratically imposed pauses, Goguryeu's defenders caught their breath, reinforced their positions, and tightened their defenses. By the time summer arrived, the Sui main army, with all its size, power, and resources, had failed to capture a single border fortress. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking, supplies were thinning, and the deep penetration vanguard was marching farther and farther ahead. The entire vanguard plan really rested on just two fragile pillars. First, the physical strength and stamina of that 305,000-man strike force, and second, a steady flow of supplies arriving from the Sui Navy sailing down the coast. But almost as soon as the campaign began, both of those pillars started to wobble. The vanguard's logistical plan assumed the troops could carry enough food, tools, and equipment to last the full length of their march toward Pyongyang. But this sounded a lot more realistic in Chang'an than it did on the actual ground. The terrain was brutal, and the weight of the supplies slowed progress to a painful crawl. Soldiers were drained. Horses collapsed. And then something predictable, but devastating, started happening. As exhaustion mounted, men began throwing away gear. First came the heavy equipment, then tools. Then, in the most desperate stretches, soldiers even abandoned food they considered too heavy to carry. Every day they marched, the vanguard became lighter, but also weaker, hungrier, and more exposed. If there was one thing that might have saved them, it was the fleet. The 305,000-man expedition marching toward Pyongyang relied entirely on one promise, that the Navy, under Lai Huer, would sail supplies down the coast and meet them along the Taedong River. That fleet wasn't just support, it was the Army's lifeline. Without it, there was no way such a massive force could hope to stay fed and functional so far from Liaodong. But then Goguryeo forces ambushed Lai Huer's fleet. One sudden strike, ships captured or destroyed, the river route cut off, and just like that, the vanguard's entire logistical backbone snapped. In an age where one soldier might need 3 to 5 pounds of grain per day, they suddenly realized that everything they were counting on simply wasn't going to arrive. The math alone becomes terrifying. Yet despite the land failures at Liaodong, despite the slow-motion collapse of their supply chain, the expectation from the imperial court didn't change. A victory was not optional. The emperor wanted results, and he wanted them fast. So Yuan Shu and Yu Zhongwen pressed forward anyway. They pushed this enormous, isolated column deeper past the border sieges, knowing full well they were marching beyond any realistic hope of resupply. What started as an elite strike force had now become something far more desperate. An army betting its survival on reaching Pyongyang before exhaustion overtook it. And this brings us to the moment everything crystallized, the Battle of Salsu. The Salsu River, known today as the Cheongchon, flows outward toward the Yellow Sea. On the map, it looks ordinary, but its position made it the last major barrier between the Sui vanguard and Pyongyang. It sat only 30 li from the capital, about 12 kilometers, close enough to tempt the Sui into pushing just a little farther, and just far enough to be deadly. For a retreating army, the Salsu was even more unforgiving. You had to cross it coming in and cross it again going out, and there weren't many crossing points available. Eulji Mundyuk, Goguryeo's commander, understood exactly what that meant. So he turned the river into a funnel. He didn't meet the Sui head-on. Instead, he fought and intentionally lost 7 times. Each loss let him give ground slowly, deliberately, always retreating just enough to keep the Sui moving forward. Each small skirmish drained the Sui a little more, pushing them deeper into enemy territory and further from their logistical base. Every mile added to their exhaustion. Every minor victory increased their vulnerability. By manipulating the Sui army's movements, Mundyuk forced them to march beyond the point where they could sustain themselves. By the time the 305,000 Sui soldiers reached the outskirts of Pyongyang, the signs of collapse were unmistakable. The men who had marched in full pride across Liaodong now looked ghost-like, thin, dehydrated, stumbling. The phrase used in the sources is blunt. They were starving and exhausted. And that exhaustion was measurable. No army of that size could function with empty wagons and dwindling rations. A siege was impossible. Even a normal field battle would have been a stretch. They were running on the last fumes of morale, marching on the hope that Pyongyang might somehow fall quickly enough to save them. But by the time the Sui commanders, Yuan Shu and Yu Zhongwen, reached the outskirts of Pyongyang, they finally understood just how bad their situation truly was. The capital wasn't just fortified. It was a fortress city guarded by deep walls, layered defenses, and fresh troops who had been waiting for this exact moment. And right when this doubt began spreading through the Sui leadership, General Yulji Mundeok struck. He sent Yu Zhongwen a short, elegant poem praising the Sui generals' divine plans and heaven-reaching brilliance. It flattered him so heavily that it almost sounded sarcastic. And then came the twist. If the Sui had already won so many victories, Yulji suggested, why not be satisfied and go home? Yu Zhongwen didn't know it was bait. Right after sending the poem, Yulji followed with something even more tempting. A formal offer to surrender, but only if the Sui army pulled back immediately. Inside the Sui command tent, that offer was the perfect excuse they needed. They couldn't take Pyongyang. They didn't have supplies. Their men were collapsing. And Emperor Yang was hundreds of miles away, demanding victory, but offering no flexibility. So a fake surrender suddenly seemed like a diplomatic win they could show the emperor. And just like that, the retreat order was issued. After accepting what they believed was a surrender, Sui commanders Yuan Shu and Yu Zhongwen ordered a rapid retreat back toward Liaodong. To protect their flanks, they attempted to organize into a defensive square, known as a fangzhen. It was a solid tactic, a dense, protective formation that could resist attacks from multiple directions. But the realities on the ground were brutal. This wasn't a fresh, rested army. This was 305,000 men who had marched hundreds of kilometers, weakened by hunger, heat, disease, and near-constant stress. They now had to cover 450 li of hostile territory, roughly 180 miles, while keeping formation. The sheer exhaustion made maneuvering impossible. Then came the river. The Salsu was no gentle stream. It was a natural bottleneck, narrow and fast-flowing in places. Crossing it forced the Sui army to funnel into a long, exposed column. That square formation, rendered meaningless. Their vast numbers, which might have been overwhelming on open terrain, were now trapped, divided, and completely vulnerable. On the opposite banks, Goguryau's forces waited, hidden from view, positioned for maximum devastation. This was no conventional engagement. It was carefully calculated annihilation. Timing was everything. Mundeok waited until roughly half of the Sui army was mid-crossing, caught in the river's choke point. That moment split the massive force in two. Those trapped mid-river or struggling onto the far bank, exposed and disorganized, and those left on the near bank, unable to cross in time, now facing the full fury of Goguryau's attack. Goguryau's forces could strike with devastating efficiency, using ranged weapons, cavalry charges, and ambush tactics precisely when the enemy's cohesion was at its lowest. Historically, many popular accounts, fueled by later nationalist historians, claim that Yulji Mundeok used a dam to unleash a flash flood on the Sui army during the crossing of the Salsu River. But contemporary records from the time don't support that. There's no mention of a dam or deliberate manipulation of water. What really mattered, however, was the strategic exploitation of the river itself. Munduk knew that the crossing would naturally disrupt the Sui forces. The river's current, its depth, and uneven riverbed turned into a force multiplier, making the heavily armored Sui cataphracts slow and unwieldy, and exhausting the infantry even further. In effect, the river became Goguryeu's primary weapon, a natural obstacle perfectly timed to strike at the enemy's weakest point. To make matters worse for the Sui, targeted attacks took out key command figures. Right General Xing Shixiong was killed in the onslaught, immediately decapitating leadership in the rear ranks. Suddenly the army was leaderless, trapped between the river behind them and a disciplined attacking force in front. Chaos erupted. Soldiers could no longer follow orders. Formations collapsed, and the massive 305,000-strong column began to fracture under pressure. Once panic set in, it only accelerated. The remnants of the Sui column fled in a desperate, chaotic retreat toward the Yalu River, trying to cover roughly 450 li, or about 180 kilometers, in a single day and night. That distance alone gives a sense of the total breakdown. These were not tactical maneuvers anymore. It was a flight for survival. Exhausted, starving, leaderless, and continuously harried by Goguryeo forces, the Sui army was systematically annihilated. Every factor that had been a vulnerability, the overextended supply line, the exhaustion of the troops, the rigid command structure, and the natural bottleneck of the river, combined perfectly under Munduk's control. The result was a catastrophic rout, one that would echo through history as a masterclass in strategic planning, psychological warfare, and terrain exploitation. Of the 305,000 elite troops who had crossed the Liao River in the push toward Pyongyang, only about 2,700 made it back to the main Sui encampment at Liaodong Fortress. Some sources suggest the number might have been 7,700, but either way, over 300,000 men were lost. That's a casualty rate of more than 99%, an almost unimaginable destruction for any army in any era. The sheer scale of the loss makes Salsu one of the deadliest battles of classical military history, not because of the fighting itself, but because the enemy's exhaustion, stretched supply lines, and fragmented command were turned into an operational weapon. Strategically, the destruction of the vanguard nullified the objectives of the entire 612 campaign. The larger Sui forces that had remained stuck at border fortresses, unable to advance or relieve the trapped vanguard, had no choice but to withdraw. Goguryeo had effectively solved its strategic problem. The Sui army's overwhelming numbers, which should have been its greatest advantage, became its Achilles heel. Superior intelligence, careful deception, and precise timing rendered the Sui column vulnerable and doomed. For the Sui Dynasty, the repercussions were immediate and severe. Emperor Yang's credibility suffered a catastrophic blow. The loss of so many elite soldiers, combined with the failure to achieve any military objectives, drained resources and undermined confidence in the central government. Subsequent invasions in 613 and 614 were met with fierce resistance, internal rebellions, and draft evasion, a direct consequence of the enormous manpower and economic toll inflicted by the 612 disaster. Salsu wasn't just a battlefield victory for Goguryeo. It was a decisive turning point that reshaped the political and military landscape of Northeast Asia. The immediate and most direct consequence of the Salsu disaster was nothing short of catastrophic for the Sui Dynasty. The relentless military campaigns against Goguryeo, spanning 4 major invasions between 598 and 614 CE, had already drained the empire's treasury. But Salsu pushed the system past its breaking point. Hundreds of thousands of elite combat troops were lost, and with them went the backbone of the centralized military and economic apparatus. The human cost alone was staggering. Families lost sons, fathers, and brothers. Entire regions felt the absence of able-bodied men who had been conscripted into the endless campaigns. The financial toll mirrored the human one. Funding these massive armies required constant taxation, and as the state tried to replenish its lost manpower, conscription became harsher. Villages resisted, revolts erupted, civil unrest spread like wildfire, and the empire's stability crumbled from within. In effect, Salsu acted as the spark that ignited the flames of collapse. Just 6 years later, in 618 CE, the Sui Dynasty fell, replaced by the Tang. Traditional historians consistently point to Emperor Yang's disastrous foreign wars, especially the campaigns against Goguryeo, as the central reason for the dynasty's short-lived rule. But the implications of Salsu went beyond China's borders. The battle reshaped regional geopolitics and military thinking for decades. On the Korean peninsula, Goguryeo victory established a clear deterrent. When the Tang dynasty rose under Emperor Gaozu, they approached the idea of invading Goguryeo very differently. Unlike the Sui, the Tang initially relied on diplomacy, peace overtures, and carefully staged preparations rather than rushing a massive, single-thrust invasion. Salsu had created a hard lesson. Numerical superiority alone was insufficient. Conquering Goguryeo required meticulous planning, extensive logistics, and respect for local terrain and defensive expertise. The battle also became a classic case study in asymmetric warfare and strategic defense. Mundeok's forces were smaller, but they had advantages the Sui could not counter: intelligence, terrain mastery, operational flexibility, and highly disciplined mobile units like the Gema Musa cavalry. Against these forces, the Sui's rigid centralized command, massive numbers, and reliance on continuous supply lines became weaknesses rather than strengths. The victory showed that intelligence, deception, and timing could neutralize even the largest invading armies. For the history enthusiast, Salsu offers profound lessons about how wars are won. It wasn't just about swords clashing or catapults firing. It was about understanding the enemy's structural weaknesses, manipulating their movements, and turning their own logistical demands into weapons. Munduk's brilliance lay in transforming the Sui army itself into the instrument of its own destruction. By forcing them to overextend into hostile terrain and exhausting their supply lines, he allowed hunger, fatigue, and disorder to decimate 305,000 troops without needing to destroy them all in direct combat. In the end, Salsu overturns the conventional wisdom that sheer numbers determine victory. It confirms that operational reach, command flexibility, and intelligent exploitation of terrain and logistics can outmatch overwhelming numerical superiority. The disaster also serves as a cautionary tale for any military system relying on centralized control and massive, inflexible formations. Against a decentralized, adaptive opponent capable of shaping the battlefield to its advantage, the largest army in the world can still be broken, routed, and utterly destroyed. Salsu remains a testament to the power of strategy over strength, deception over might, and planning over sheer force. A lesson that resonates well beyond the 7th century, still echoing through military thought today. If you loved this video, hit like and subscribe for more insane battles and epic strategies. Drop a comment and tell us what move you think was the smartest at Salsu. We love hearing your takes. Stay tuned, because the next story of impossible victories is just around the corner.